Hello, and welcome to another episode of Expansive and Unscripted. Today, I am excited to be here with Kelly Green. She is a DEI and A consultant and advocate. So that stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which the A often gets left out, doesn't it, Kelly?
Always, yes, yes,
um, yeah, and we're going to talk about that more today.
yeah,
So, you work with people managers to create more neuro inclusive, psychologically safe, and accessible workspaces. You bring your wealth of lived and learned experience to that work.
mhm, mhm,
As someone who lives with a physical disability of multiple sclerosis and as a fellow neurokin, um, you have that firsthand experience of navigating the world that is not designed with with those of us with disabilities and neurodivergence in mind.
exactly.
Yeah, so welcome. I'm
Thank
excited for you
you.
to be here.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this
Absolutely.
conversation.
Yes. So we kind of met through Raven Solomon's DEIER. That's
Right.
a live audio show on LinkedIn on Fridays.
Hmm.
And I was so excited because someone other than me made a comment in the discussion around like, okay, but we got to remember like neurodivergent people and neuro
Right.
inclusion.
Right.
And so I was like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to this person because you usually I'm the only one that's piping up about like the neuro inclusion and non-apparent disabilities
Right.
accessibility side of things. So
Hmm.
tell me a little bit about how you got into this work as a like as something that you are doing professionally, not just something you are living out in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, it was almost by accident, really. I was working with people with disabilities, helping them to get into customizable employment options because a lot of times we're not able, depending on your disability, you're not able to work a typical 9 to 5. I know I get up some days and I can't get out of bed until whenever, whenever it's
Mhm.
okay for me or whenever I have the energy to do so. So I was working, I knew there were other people like that out there who still had the talents and skills. I worked in the music business for 15 years. So I was a marketer. I still had that ambition that I wanted to do marketing and personal branding. So my first idea was to help those people who were in similar situations. But then what I
Mhm.
realized is that it wasn't just the people with disabilities, it was the actual employers, getting them
Mm.
to understand why it was important to be more inclusive in their workspaces, why they needed to expand their horizons beyond just the ADA checklists and the curb cuts and making sure that there was a
Mhm.
handicap parking space, because that's all people think about when they think about accessible facilities or accessible areas.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so it was really like that. And then in my speaking and consulting work and doing personal branding, working with people with disabilities, I just got into more and more talking about DEIA and the importance of that and why there needed to be more of a wider landscape or wider net spread out to people who were not only physically disabled, but like you and I have neurodivergent. Um,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's so much that's overlooked for folks with non-apparent disabilities. Like you said, the first thing people think about is accessible parking and bathrooms and elevators and
right.
you know
And they barely do that correctly. So,
right. 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 Like, yeah, it's so um it's so wild to me. Some of the things I'm learning about as I connect with and follow on social media other disabled professionals and disability justice advocates. Um, there are just some well intentioned but so very misguided
Mm-hmm.
things that we see in physical design as well as like culture design, right?
Right.
In organizations, and I often hear too from leaders, this idea of like, well, nobody's come forward to share this, so like I think we're good. We don't have that population and
Right.
and I can guarantee, yes, you have neurodivergent, you have non-apparent disabled employees that are
Absolutely.
working for you. If they
Absolutely.
haven't come forward, it's because there's not accessibility and or psychological safety to do so.
Exactly. I always turn it around on them like, well, what have you done to create the environment that makes people feel comfortable enough that they won't be sidelined or worse, fired? Because I truly believe that once I disclose my disability and my I won't say limitations, but accessibility needs, I should say. And it wasn't just physical for me. I mentally and emotionally, I
Mhm.
thought I was being burnt out, but it turned out that it was a neurodivergent condition that I wasn't aware
Mhm.
of. There was no word for it back then.
Mm.
So I had trouble identifying it, but I also had trouble communicating that to my employer. So yeah, I turn it back on them. Like, it's not up
Mhm.
to us as the person with the disability or the accommodation needs. Don't put it on us. It's up to you to create that environment. So that's what I try to do now is try to help them see it from that point of view.
Yeah, I love that. I look at when I think about disability, I think about, kind of the, physical, medical, mental disabilities that we can experience inside ourselves.
Mhm.
I think about environment, like disabling environments and disabling spaces, right? So
Right.
I've I've tried to shift some of my language when I'm talking with employers, when I'm talking with people who are running events and spaces around like the problem is not on the disabled person. The
Right.
problem is the disabling factors at play in the space and in the design of the event.
Mhm.
And there's so many things that um, folks don't think about, and honestly, I didn't think about them until I had to think about them, right?
Yeah.
So I have that grace for for kind of the trajectory of learning, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of things that aren't on our mind if we don't live that experience. That's part of the
Right.
work of DEIA, right? To help folks, like, you don't have to have this lived experience to believe someone
So
about their
appreciate it.
experience
Right.
and trust them
Absolutely.
that they know what they need.
Mhm, mhm. I like that word disabling spaces. I just wrote that down because it's so true. We live in this society where it was taught to rest when you die or work
Mhm.
hard and hustle. You got to hustle hard all the time. And that's just not possible for a lot of people. Even if you don't have a labeled or diagnosed disability, that's just not the way to work. I used to have a boss that said, "Work harder, not smart." I mean, work smart, not hard. Like I'm or
Mhm.
whatever. You know what I'm trying to
Yes.
say. But yeah, I mean that mentality of rest when you die is just not conducive, and it wasn't conducive for somebody like me. And being in the music industry, that is such fast pace, and it's not a typical 9 to 5. It's work 10 to
Mhm.
7, and then after that you got to go to a night function, and then after that go to the studio, and next thing you know it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. That just wasn't feasible for me after a certain point in time.
Mhm.
And I had to
Yeah.
let them know that I needed psychologically and emotionally safe spaces that supported my needs.
Hmm.
And like I said, I wasn't able to really communicate that because I wasn't sure what was going on with myself. So I help people. I think it's important that you and I and people like us who are advocates in this space and have these lived experiences communicate that on behalf of those that don't have a voice.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to explore for a moment. So we use these terms of psychological safety, and I think a lot of people use those words, and maybe people don't exactly understand, like, what does that actually look like when we're talking about disability and accessibility. um, what does psychological safety mean for folks with disabilities? What does that mean to you?
For me, it meant um, them, the employer or hiring manager or HR person, asking questions. I don't mind, and I've never met a person with a need that minds being asked questions. That's the only way they'll get to understand our lived experiences and our needs. So when I feel like I'm being listened to,
Hmm.
excuse me, when I feel like I'm being listened to, when I feel like you're taking an interest in what I'm saying, as opposed to me saying, no, I can't work after 5 o'clock. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that
Mm.
there will be days where I need a little bit of grace. Maybe I leave early, but then come back. Or maybe I start later in as opposed to the regular time. So I think
Mhm.
that the open communication and the willingness to learn and listen to people with needs um, creates that environment, creates an
Yes.
environment where you feel safe to be able to communicate your needs. I met a woman recently who works at Walmart's corporate offices, and she has a condition. It's a rare condition, but she has to have a quiet space, and she has to have downtime during the day. And
Mhm.
her bosses were very accommodating. I mean, they took this little break room and made it dark so that she could go in during the times that she needed and take her rest, whether it was a nap or whether it was just quiet time. She needed that time in order to be more productive. And that's what a lot of people I think don't get.
Mm.
In order for me to be more productive, I need these accommodations. I need
Yes.
this safe space. So when you look at it from that end, where it creates more innovation, creates more creativity, which always adds to the bottom line. And I know that
Mhm.
employers, that's their first thing. How is this going
Mhm.
to affect me financially? And just by
Yeah.
letting you know that, yeah, this is benefiting you financially. This is not going to hurt your bottom line. This is not going to take away money. In fact, it only adds money to the bottom line because think about it. You will have to hire someone else, train someone else, go through the
Mhm.
onboarding process. All of that costs money as opposed to
Yeah.
just working with me and my needs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And that working with you and other employees, create it's to create sustainability,
Right.
right? So it's, I think there's often this fear narrative that gets perpetuated, like, oh, people are just trying to get out of the work, they're just trying to, like,
Hmm.
have it easy. No, like, most people, if they're trying to get out of the work, they're just gonna stay under the radar, be quiet, and,
Right.
like, play games on their computer all day. Like, they're not going to be drawing attention to themselves and their needs. So the other piece I think that is so important that you mentioned is the listening to you and trusting and believing that you know what you need to
Hmm.
support yourself.
Hmm.
And that, yes, when we can have, additional breaks, that's replenishing our bandwidth and our capacity to continue the work. I have so many conversations with folks around kind of having to fight their employer on return to the office mandates.
Yeah.
And, they're navigating like, look, you can have me in the office and I'm going to be there for whatever number of hours and I'm going to get some stuff done. Or you can have me like focused at my best in the home space because I didn't have to deal with
Right.
like getting ready to leave the house, didn't have to deal with a commute, public transit, don't have to deal with all the extraneous things that happen in the office of like
Right.
socializing and noises and distractions. So it's like, what what is the priority here? Do you want quality work
Right.
and an employee who can continue doing that quality work, or do you want my body in the space
And it's
doing
usually the
whatever?
latter. They just want the body in the space to say that everybody's here today, but are we really all here? Not really.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
also see psychological safety as, reducing the number of assumptions people make about other
Mhm.
people. Um, Part of the safety piece is when we disclose certain needs or certain elements of like, hey, this is how my brain works, that not be used against us in performance reviews, that
Right.
not be used to hold us back from leadership development and promotional
Promotions.
opportunities,
Right.
which is something I'm sure you have seen. I've definitely seen a ton of, right? That makes it like it's not safe for me to get support
Mm-mm.
because I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who have gone through the accommodation process only to be let go shortly thereafter, or
Mhm.
folks who disclose a need early on and have an offer rescinded or not even get an offer in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier about staying under the radar, and I can totally relate to that because I didn't want to be seen as different or not capable of performing my duties. So I just
Mhm.
stayed under the radar, which backfired, honestly, because it looked like I couldn't do the job. Even what I was trying to
Mhm.
prevent ended up happening anyway because I was staying under the radar because I didn't feel like I could come out and I couldn't
Mhm.
say what I needed to say or I couldn't articulate what I needed to articulate. And that's totally understandable that somebody as the employee, you can't really sometimes articulate what
Mhm.
it is that you need. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
working
I
with
think,
both sides is important.
yeah. And I think about that, what you just said, can't always articulate what you need. Think about that a lot for so many of us who are late identified neurodivergent. Like, I
Mhm.
came into awareness of my learning differences and neurodivergence in my 40s. That's a lot of life to
Yeah,
live without that piece of information. And
absolutely.
people can say, like, how did you not know? What I knew is that most things are a struggle for me.
Mhm.
Why? The narrative that I have been given in life is, either that I'm lazy or I'm not trying hard enough,
Mm,
or, I just don't care enough. Like, those
right,
are stories that were imposed on me. But the reality is, I'm dyslexic. I have dyscalculia. Have I'm autistic. I have ADHD. Right? All these things combined
mhm,
make it more challenging for me to navigate certain situations than folks who are not dealing with those barriers.
right,
Um, but I didn't have language to be able to describe that or even know how to support myself in that.
right, and then you begin to internalize it and then live it. So you
Hmm.
actually bring to fruition the thing that you're trying to avoid, which is that I don't fit in. I'm not like everybody else. I'm not normal. This is just me. I'm the only one that thinks like this. I'm the only one that behaves like this. And like you
Yeah.
said, chances are the employer who is scared to actually acknowledge that there are people within his organization, just because they haven't said anything doesn't mean that they don't exist. They're there.
Hmm. Yeah.
They're there.
Yeah. Another element that you kind of alluded to, and I want to shine some more light on, is the piece about the like dynamic fluctuating capacity, which I think is really challenging for a lot of people to understand about, um, like disability. So much of disability is not black and white. It's not either or,
Right.
right? It's, you know, I will have capacity for these things when I have these supports in place. When I don't have these supports in place, I don't have this capacity. So
Mhm.
there's a fluctuation there. Sometimes even with all of the supports and accommodations, our body just decides when we wake up, like, no, I'm not gonna today.
Yeah.
Let's just,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
right. And that's not always predictable. Um, and and I think it seems like a lot of people struggle to understand, like, well, you were able to do this last week, how come you can't, like,
Right.
what's the problem, why can't you show up this week?
Mhm. Yeah, that's again, creating that safe space so that I
Mhm.
can feel comfortable enough to tell you today is one of those days that I was telling you about before where I need to work from home and
Mhm.
not feeling like there are going to be any type of repercussions because I need that time. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's okay.
Mhm.
Employees need to feel like it's okay. Employers need to realize that it should be okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm kind of the belief that w- disability or no disability, like, we all have fluctuating capacity. I
Absolutely.
think that's a human thing,
Yeah.
not just a disabled person thing, right?
Right.
Like, we are not machines,
Mm.
and so we're not going to perform like machines.
Right. I mean, I'm not a mother, but mothers have certain things that they need to take care of in their life that I will
Hmm.
never understand because I'm not a mother, but it just helps the whole team. It helps everyone when you give space or
Yes.
create a safe space for that person to be able to have that work-life balance. I know that
Hmm.
word is overused and a lot of people don't believe that there is such a thing, but there needs to be for the good of everybody,
Hmm.
not just the person
Yeah.
with disability. Right.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, that flexibility and accessibility piece serves all people, right?
Right.
Caregivers of children, people who
Mhm.
are caretaking of elder parents or family members, folks who
Right.
have, all different identities, realities, socioeconomic, um, you know, situations. Yeah, I'm it's one of the hills I'll die on, is that, like, accessibility serves everyone.
Everybody, right. I had to bring it to someone's attention in a talk that I was giving, like, if these curb cuts didn't exist, how would you get your stroller onto the
Mhm.
sidewalk? Or if you have on high heels that day, imagine if
Mhm.
that curb cut wasn't there. I mean, it's just so many things that we take for granted and don't even think about that benefit all of us. I think that people have this one idea of what a disabled person looks like. Before I was using a walker, multiple sclerosis, for any of you who don't know, is a neurological disorder, but it's also autoimmune disorder. And it presents itself differently for everyone. Some people have blindness or temporary blindness. Some people it affects their legs. Some people it affects their arms. The the messages don't get from your brain to the rest of the parts of your body. So
Mm.
some people automatically what they call progress, which is primary progressive. I know I'm using a lot of terms that people don't
You're
know,
good.
but it just presents differently for everybody. And a lot of times I wasn't aware, is this the MS or is this just me getting older, or is just me going through a certain period in my life where things are changing. So it was hard. Actually, a doctor had to say to me, Kelly, you're more than your MS, because I only had a neurologist. I didn't have a primary care physician.
Mm.
And she was like, why? I mean, there's so many other aspects to your life than just your brain. And I had to think
Mhm.
about that. Like, why don't I have a primary care physician? So anyway, getting back to just how all of those things help uplift society as a whole, and getting out of our mindset of everyone with a disability looks the same, needs the same
Mhm.
things, is asking for the same things, or this stigma attached to disability that we're lazy or that we can't do or don't want to do. It's not that we don't want to do, we just haven't been given the opportunity a lot of times to do what it is that we're capable of.
Right. And in the way that we are capable of doing it.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
that's so often what folks buck up against is like this is the one way. I mean, even the return to office, that is not the only way to effectively work.
Right.
And we've seen remote work is absolutely when I
Possible.
when I look at the data of all of the businesses that had record profits during
Yeah,
2020, 2021,
right.
when the most remote work was happening,
Mhm.
clearly it's not detrimental to business.
Absolutely. And I don't understand why people don't see that. I think they're still in that mentality, like more bodies in the seats in the office means that we're being more productive. And that's absolutely not the case. Like you said, the data is there to
Mhm.
support it. And with all of this technology, that's what the technology is for, so that we can have workers in different spaces, in different areas, from different cultures, different backgrounds, using their capabilities to bring the most to that job.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about stigma, and I want to bring our conversation to a huge discussion that is ongoing, I think, in the larger community around the use of the word disability, disabled, right?
Mhm.
There are, I see this a lot in the neurodivergent community. There are folks who say, like, yes, I recognize my neurodivergence as a disability, and there are elements of it that are disabling.
Mhm.
There are folks who are like, nope, I refuse to use that word.
Mhm.
Um, my neurodivergence is a superpower,
Yeah.
and I'm, not going to be associated with that. So I'd love
Mhm.
to explore this dynamic with you, because I think it's an important part of the broader mm, conversation and practice of accessibility.
Yeah. I and it's true. Once I found out that I was neurodivergent and started looking into it, I did see a lot of people say, "No, I'm not disabled. I don't have a disability. This is my superpower, and I use it in this way and that way." And I think because there's so much discrepancy within the community, or so many differences, I believe that we're all on a spectrum of some sort. We're
Mhm.
all on a spectrum. Multiple sclerosis is on the spectrum. Cancer is on the spectrum. We're all on a spectrum. Women are on a spectrum. So coming to a common belief would help those who are not uh, disabled, I want to say, understand what the needs are, and it doesn't just look one certain way. We don't all use a scooter or a wheelchair. We don't all use a cane or crutches. Just like someone who's autistic doesn't have the same capabilities in terms of speaking or processing information. It's the same thing with everybody, and
Mhm.
getting employers to understand that, or society as a whole. Basically, it's not just the employers, because you bring your background to work with you, you bring your biases to work with you. So getting society as a whole to understand that it doesn't look like that blue and white sign of somebody in a wheelchair and needing special parking accommodations.
Mhm.
It's more than that. There's more that goes into that, and just being able to have those conversations and being open to listening to people and their needs would go a long way in cutting down that stigma of
Mhm.
what a disability looks like and is for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are people who don't use mobility devices who need to have access to accessible parking because of,
Mhm.
just because they're not using a mobility device doesn't mean that like they're perfectly fine with walking, right?
Right, right.
um and I think too there's I mean, so much of my experience over the last several years has been pretty rigorous deconstructing of the internalized ableism that is in me, because like I think it's inherent in all of us who are raised within an ableist system. Like it's unavoidable,
Mhm.
and part of the work is deconstructing that.
Right.
So I didn't immediately adopt the identifier of disabled person. Um, when I came into my neurodivergence, there are a number of things going on that I think about. Um, Part of it was like, well, I don't know that I'm like disabled enough to count or to call
Mhm.
myself that, or,
Right.
um, I don't want to appropriate space that is not
Right.
actually mine. I want to honor folks who are like legit disabled, right?
Mhm, mhm.
There's a lot of stuff that I wrestled with, and some of that was also the like how I felt about myself if I use the language of I'm a disabled person.
Mhm.
And what are other people going, thinking about what other people are going to think about me.
Right.
Ultimately, I have adopted that language. I describe myself as a dynamically disabled person, because my capacity and ability fluctuates. It's not a permanent state of one way or another.
Right. I like that. I love
But
that.
I think that term, I mean, for one, it garners more. Um, it demands more respect and acknowledgement, like we've said with employers, like you have to have a documented disability in order to get ADA accommodations, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes our systems require official terminology in
Right.
order to give us access to certain things. um I also think it's important to like destigmatize that like disability is a bad thing. um what do I mean when I'm saying that? Like it's uh like it's a dirty word.
Yeah, it automatically says can't.
Mm,
When somebody says disabled, it's like, okay, they can't, what can't they do?
hmm. Yeah. um and I know a lot of folks in the disability justice movement who speak on, it's a kind of erasure when community leaders, advocates refuse to use disability. Like, no, I'm not disabled. I'm something else. They use some other
Mhm. Differently
euphemism.
abled or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it it discounts the reality of the disabling elements of various identities and conditions, which then also makes it harder for society to be on board with, like, oh, this person has needs. We need to respect that. This person has
Mhm.
limitations. We need
Mhm.
to honor that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I was like you too before I started using a walker or a cane. I had MS, but a lot of times you wouldn't know it. So me trying to explain to someone how, there may be times when I'm down and I have to go into the hospital for a course of steroids, and I don't know how long I'll be there, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. And this was before all the Zoom and cell phones, and this was when technology was very limited, but still I could, there were other people there that could step in and do the work for me when I was unable to. But just the fact that you say you're disabled, which is why I never said it, didn't want to say it because I knew that there was a stigma attached to it. And even in my ableist mind, I was thinking, I don't want to be labeled as not being able to do something. This was my dream job of working in New York
Mm,
City in the music industry. I mean, it was like a fast-paced life, on the go all the time, traveling, meeting all these new people. So yeah, I didn't want to use that term either. I absolutely knew what the stigma was or what other people would think about me, or I assumed what other people would think about me. And there were a
mhm,
lot of times when people surprised me and they were very supportive and very accommodating. A lot of people say, "Oh, my mother has that," or "My sister has
mm,
that," and I've seen what it does to them. And so, you just never know who is dealing with what, who's
mhm,
dealing with a similar situation, and they can understand. So I think those conversations need to happen more often. That is why I think the A in DEIA is so important, because being inclusive and equitable and diverse means that you lead with accessibility, whether
yes.
that's a physical accessibility, emotional accessibility, psychological accessibility. All of those things work hand in hand. It's not just a race and gender thing.
Yes. Yes. I often say, I mean, I believe and am a champion of, like, equity and inclusion are the results of accessibility.
Mhm.
You're not going to have, like, they're the outcome when we are
Absolutely.
designing and practicing and implementing accessibility. The natural byproduct is more equitable spaces and
Right.
opportunities, more inclusive spaces. Um,
Absolutely. I love that. That makes sense. I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's absolutely what that is.
um, and I appreciate you kind of going back to what you were saying about your own journey. I appreciate you sharing about kind of the process of coming into acceptance of, yeah, I'm disabled and I'm going to use this language. And
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of shift that's happening. Many folks are moving away from the medical model that, like, pathologizes and disorders everything of the human experience, in favor of a social model that adopts more of, like, an identity based approach to things. Like, autism is an identity, not a
Mhm.
diagnosis, not
Right.
something wrong that needs to be cured,
Not
right?
to be fixed.
There's also middle ground, right? There's still medical conditions that we are important to acknowledge and recognize and accommodate. um so I want to make room for, like, I'm not saying everybody has to use the word disabled to describe themselves. um Folks, I definitely support folks having the autonomy to determine how they identify themselves and
Absolutely.
what language they use. I think where it gets dangerous is when there are unclear statements about, this is my narrative, right? Like if like recently I saw a post that said autism is not a disability, and it like there that was the graphic that went with it, and there was a
Mhm.
lot of conversation around like, well, not, I mean, I don't agree with that. And the
Mhm.
person was like, well, this is my narrative, but the
Mhm.
graphic didn't identify, like, my narrative is that I don't see autism as a disability, right?
Right.
So I think that's where it gets tricky. Like, I don't want there to be, only one way to for people to speak about their identities. Um, but as we, you know, as I talk about things, I try to qualify the way that I identify is autistic and ADHD are disabilities and part of my identity. And I
Mhm.
recognize that folks have different ways of seeing those parts of themselves and giving language to that.
Yeah. It's funny that you said that because I have a friend whose son is autistic and he's nonverbal. He uses sign language a lot. But she,
Mm,
we were talking about handicapped spaces because I sometimes I get mad when I see people in handicapped spaces and they get out the car and they look fine, but who am I to judge? Like I don't know why you're
mm,
in that handicap space. You might just be abusing it, but you really might need it. And she was telling me that her 16-year-old son, who is very tall, almost 200 pounds, looks like a football player, he gets easily distracted by noises and a lot of commotion. So she
mm,
needs that handicap space closer to the door because the further back she parks, the more incidences may occur,
mm.
or she puts her son in harm's way by being further away from the door. And I
Yeah.
never thought about that. Like I never ever thought about that. I just thought, again, in my ableist mind, disability looks one way, and I'm a
Mhm.
disabled person. So if I had
Yes.
that thought, then imagine all the other people out there in society who have those same thoughts. But it made so
Yes.
much sense. Like we really have to reframe our thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. I there are many times I catch myself making some kind of judgment or assumption,
Mhm.
and I think I will probably be in the process of uh extricating ableist thinking and practice for myself for forever. I don't know that that is something that you can achieve, like, ta-da,
Right.
I'm all
Right.
clear.
Peop
So I appreciate your vulnerability and candor around, like, yeah, I'm working on this too. And there are times where we as disabled people can get frustrated and be passionate and heated about certain elements of advocacy. And
Mhm.
also, um i I'm a huge proponent of, like, leading with curiosity, that can
Absolutely.
carry us a long way.
Absolutely.
When I'm seeing someone in the accessible parking space and they don't have an apparent, uh what I think should look like apparent disability, giving myself permission to be curious about, well, maybe there's things going on that I don't know or understand
Mhm.
about, and that's okay. It's not my job to police who's using the
Right.
accessible parking spots,
Right.
even though, like, sometimes my brain thinks it is my job.
Mhm. Absolutely. There are days when I'm so tired and I see all the handicap spaces gone, and I just automatically assume that somebody's abusing this opportunity right here, or it
Mhm.
abusing their privileges. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, being human is such a challenging experience.
Yes,
just
it's
across the
tiring
board.
sometimes. It's
So,
tiring, but leading with
yes,
curiosity, like you said, can go a long way.
yeah, and giving ourselves grace and
Grace,
compassion.
yes, mhm,
I
yeah,
think the more we practice that for ourselves, the easier it is to give
give it.
others the
Mhm,
grace and compassion.
yes, yes.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. And before we wrap up, I would love to ask you, Kelly, if the audience walks away from this conversation with like one kind of nugget or gem, what do you hope that is for folks listening and reading our
I think
conversation?
you just said it best, leading with curiosity. Don't make assumptions. People are open to having a conversation about what their needs are, what they're
Mhm.
wanting to see in a job or an activity or a social condition, whatever it is. People with visible and non-visible disabilities want to have that conversation. So
Mhm.
leading with curiosity, asking someone, what is it that you need? Or what is
Mhm.
it that would help you be your best self in this
Mhm.
situation? I love
Yes,
like I want to know that as a person that I'm working with, working for someone who's working for me, I want to know what it is that I can do to bring your best self to this environment.
I love that question. What do you
Mhm.
need to be your best self? It's such
Yeah.
an empowering question.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um,
And that way
so
it doesn't seem like a burden for that person
yes.
to disclose.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it normalizes it. I
Right.
love that.
Mhm.
So as a consultant, what are like how can folks connect with you? Do you have any particular programs and offerings that you want folks to know about currently?
Yeah, I would love if you think that you're in a working environment that could be more inclusive, could be more safe emotionally, psychologically, physically. If you know that there are people who may be within your workplace, and maybe they haven't been able to express what it is their needs are, then let's have a conversation. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm at LinkedIn, Kelly N. Green. You can find me there.
I'll
Kelly
be sure to
N.
put all the
and
all the
Nicole.
links
Okay.
to access you.
Okay. Yeah. So LinkedIn is the best way. But yeah, let's start by having conversations. That's the best way to do it. You may think that you're doing everything that you can to be more inclusive, but let's take a deep dive into that and see if there are areas where you might be having blind spots.
I
Because
love
we
that.
all have them. We all have them, but it
Hmm.
can be fixed.
I love that.
Mhm.
Well, and the amazing thing about collaborations and partnering with folks is that our blind spots are not always the same. So
Right.
you might have perspective on the places that I have blind spots and vice versa. And that's,
Mhm.
that's part of having diverse voices contributing
Right.
to the conversation.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. I will be sure to put links
Thank you,
in the show notes so
Jennifer.
folks can connect. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
The pleasure's all mine. Trust me. Thank you so much for having this conversation and creating this space.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, folks, stay tuned for another episode of Expansive and Unscripted, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.